Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime. I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. Recently, I had a conversation with my mom where we talked about, math and, pretty much everything, right? And at some point, we talked about math and standardized testing. And so, for this video, I'm going to talk about math and standardized testing and focus in on that. So, here's how it's going to go. I'm going to talk to you about what is a standardized test in general. As well as what it is as far as what we typically think it is, and also throughout my opinions on that, and of course, the math behind it all, right? And so I want to get into all that, and there are going to be things that I'm sure that I'm going to say in this video that not everyone is going to agree with, and I'm here to say I don't care. I want to start off with saying I don't like the idea of standardized tests. I'm going to get into why. If you hear that and you don't want to watch the rest of it, that is fair. You don't have to. Bye. But if you're curious as to why, stick around. Okay, so let's get into it. The idea of a standardized test is pretty much this. The idea that you can have a test that is consistent in the type of questions that it asks, in the scoring. It's the idea that if you have a group that is taking it, that they pretty much get the same amount of time and the same amount of questions with the same amount of difficulty, and they're graded with the same amount of fairness. That's the idea. That's the theory. Whether or not this works out in practice is a different story. For the record, it doesn't, and I'm going to get into that. And again, I don't like the idea. So yeah, I have opinions about that. And that does color how I'm going to talk about it. But I do want to talk about some examples of standardized testing, and then what we typically think of as standardized testing, right? Because when it comes to standardized tests, it pretty much fits the qualifications that I said before, because it could be something as simple as a driving test, right? It could be getting the license for a trade, right? It could be, more academic in nature, which is what we're used to. And for that record, when I'm talking about academic in nature, it could be everyday, tests, everyday quizzes. But it could be that larger scale, which that's the scale that most people are probably thinking of when I mentioned standardized test. That larger scale where maybe it's state by state, country by country, grade by grade, so on and so forth. Now, you'd be hard pressed to find a place in the world that doesn't really use standardized testing in their education system. I know, for context, I'm over here in the States, and we have been reliant on standardized testing in our school system for the last 100 years or so. It's been present longer than that, but there's been an over-reliance, I'd argue. And yeah, so now let's get into the math behind it, right? So one, how these questions are designed, and the idea of scoring, right? Because normally there are points involved when you're doing this. Now, if you're talking about the smaller scale sort of academic tests, there are the ideas that, you can get 100% and so on and so forth. And, there's the idea that, okay, you can get this many points, that many points, then this and that. And there are layers to that, right? And the type of questions that you could be asked. And then there's the idea that you could be taking a math test in particular, right? And then you're really getting into the math involved, right? But in general, a lot of these tests are scored, and numbers are used to keep track, right? And there's math in that. And there's math in the timing of these tests. There's math in the applications, right? It's this applies to this group of people, and there's the idea that you're looking at how these grades are distributed and how you could potentially apply it to people. And I'd argue that there is a problem with that, and there is an issue in whether or not these questions are actually fair, because it's who's picking the questions, what do they actually test, and all that good stuff. But again, at this point, I like to zone in a bit on school for standardized testing, because again, it could be driver tests, it could be testing for a certificate or license for a particular profession, right, or trade, same diff, more or less. But so we're focusing on the school element of that, right? it gets interesting because if we're talking about like everyday, quiz and tests, your teacher is going to be picking their concepts. They have so much time, only so much time in class, right? But that's that. There's math that goes into that timing for each lesson and how much they're going to cover in that lesson. There's math in how many students they're going to have. There's math in the grading of those exams, right? Now, I would argue that for a lot of classes, it makes sense to have a rubric, right? Assuming that you're not doing multiple choice. And so with that, it's like, how are you determining these things, right? There's math in how you're determining what works for you and how many points are going to be given per part, right? And even though there's like less calculations when you're doing multiple choice, you still have to decide, well, how much is this segment going to be worth, and so on and so forth. And with multiple choice, like if you're the person taking it, like what you do in a test, like regardless of how you worked on the problem, right? There's still a chance that you can get a problem correct, right? And so I don't know. There's something to be said about that, right? Because you got like a 25% chance if you're taking a multiple choice test where you got like 4 choices, but you might also have like true or false, and so you might have 50-50, and then you might have true or false where you have justification, in which case there might be credit that's assigned to whether or not you were right, and then there's credit whether or not you were right, but also if you had a decent enough explanation. And there's math in determining all this stuff, right? And how much each quiz and test is worth, and if you get to move on. And there's math in just like the grading, not only the grading system, but just like how you move up grade to grade, right? Like we have K to 12, we number things for the most part. And then, you have the idea in college, the grading system changes from person to person, but there's still that idea that like they might be given that standardized test for the whole class, right? And then when you talk about like standardized tests and that larger scale, like a lot of the things still sort of apply, right? Like there's this idea that, you still want a certain group to take the same sort of material. And there's like, there's different comprehension tests for like, math, reading, writing, and some of these happen like at the grade level, and you might have some every couple of grades. You might have some that are every year. And then you have things like the SAT and the ACT. You have things like the GRE, and all these are, different versions of standardized tests. And with a lot of these, you can argue whether or not they're actually fair. The idea is that they're supposed to be objective, but I ask you, how can they be? Right? Someone had to pick the standard. Someone had to decide what's fair and what's not. And the thing is, over here in the States, we don't have uniform education. People learn different things. People learn different things in different ways, right? So you're not only dealing with that, but people are taught different things, and people are taught different things in different ways. So it is debatable how well these actually hold up. Heavily debatable. Now, for the record, I have seen arguments on both sides where a lot of time, energy, and effort have been put in. And with that in mind, I still fall on the side of heavily criticizing standardized tests, whether it's just, on a classroom-to-classroom basis or on that larger scale that I'm talking about. But with that in mind, when we're talking about that larger scale, when we're talking about things like, these comprehension tests that I'm talking about, when we're talking about things like the SAT and ACT, like, not only are we dealing with math in terms of, scoring and designing these tests and just like how logistics work as a whole, but like some of these tests literally have math, in them as far as the questions are concerned. And with that, I'd argue that we don't teach math very well, collectively speaking. And that's not just a problem in the States. I'd argue that's a worldwide thing, because we teach math in the academic sense, not in the universal sense. And when we teach it in the academic sense, we don't often teach it as though it's writing when it is, right? We don't teach people the proper vocabulary always. We don't teach them how to structure their problem solving. And that's a problem. And there's a lot of issues that come with that as a result. And not everyone has that same education. And there's a lot of people who've been pushed along when they've had some really negative experiences with math. And so when they take these tests, I ask you, is it fair when we don't have the same experiences growing up, when we're not taught what math is properly? When we as a society place so much weight on it, is it truly fair? It is debatable, but I'm gonna say no. It's not remotely fair. Like, but that's not all, right? So we have math in the actual problems for a lot of these standardized tests that are larger scale. We have them in the grading, that scoring. We have math in the implications and what they could mean to society. We have math in the logistics. We have math in the timing. But here's the big thing that I'm pretty sure that I haven't mentioned to this point. There's math in the money that it takes, right? Because these things have to be funded. Like, someone is going to be putting up the cash. Like the state is, or, the students' parents are, in, the case of, K to 12 stuff. And I'd argue whether or not the student or student's parent is doing that directly, because we all pay taxes on some level, still are when the state is funding it. That's my logic with that. But regardless of where you fall on that, someone is paying. And at this point in this time, it is pricey. And logistically speaking, you have to arrange for the time. You have to arrange for the money. And it all impacts how we handle education, because a lot of people are going to be put in a position where they have to teach to the test because, there are incentives to doing so. There's also punishments for not doing so. And so it ends up being a situation where teachers are actively encouraged to make sure students are performing well enough on that test. They have to have the right numbers, right? They have to have the right scores. And that's the thing with these scores, though. There has to be a proper context, because a school could be doing well, but are they really doing well? They could be passing this test or that test collectively. Their students could be doing well on that larger scale, but are they actually learning? Are they really doing well on an individual level? Are they really doing well outside of those tests? And I'd answer that, it is debatable and it's going to depend on the situation, but it's like you can't just go off the numbers. But that's what we're doing, and it's been a thing where we're increasingly reliant on that. And like for SATs and stuff like that, even though like it is not the ultimate decision on whether or not you're going to go to college or not, it's still a factor in it. People still do view your SAT scores. That is still important. And then, you have the idea that, there's prep courses for that, and there's money in that too. And there might be people who want to do those but are not in a position where they can do those. And there might be like areas where there's actually like financial aid for that, and areas where, there's not. And there's money and how all that gets dictated, right? And there's money and how all that gets dictated, but math and how that money is represented in these sort of scenarios, right? And it's interesting and it's troubling. And I just find it fascinating because like math is at the core of all of these things, no matter how you cut it. And it's just like, but how are we using that math? And what do we want to say? And for the record, I made a video not long ago where I talked about math and IQ, where, the idea is like an IQ is supposed to be a standardized test as well. And the first SAT test was supposed to be, which is redundant, the first SAT was based off of that, like an IQ test. And the thing is, things have changed, but the idea of an IQ test is still very much baked into the SAT, into his DNA, right? No matter how many changes we've made. And in that video where I did math and IQ, I absolutely went on a rant. And for the record, when I use rant, I just mean that in the strictest sense. It was actually quite rational and well discussed, if I do say so myself. But my point is, I had an issue with IQ and IQ testing and the implications, societally speaking. And this has had long-reaching effects. And so when I think about standardized testing, I think about it on that larger scale, and I think about it on that smaller scale with everyday teaching, it is a problem. And I don't see it going away anytime soon. And so it's like, well, what do you do in that situation? It's like, I don't have the answers for it. Like, I mean, well, I have the answers like overall, right? This is like, well, the answer is to get rid of it, but it's just like, but how do you get rid of those systems, and what do you replace them with? And I think that's the tricky part that a lot of people are wondering. And even if you do have a solution that is going to work and work efficiently, how do you get people on board, right? And even if you get people on board, how do you handle it logistically? Because it's going to take time, it's going to take money, it's going to take effort. And even if people agree with you logically, even if you get so many people on board with it, even if they know it's the right decision, you know that there's going to be pushback. So my thing is like, working towards a future where we don't have to worry about things like standardized testing, where we can actually, do better as far as education, is concerned. Because right now we have this idea that testing overall and standardized testing is the way to go. And it isn't. And I don't feel like we have enough evidence to suggest that it is. We like to think that we like to think that there is. And we like to think that there's this idea of objectivity and fairness. But, it's like, I feel like the way we go about those things and it is inherently biased, and we have a lot of false correlations with things, right? Like, because, it's like, oh, this is reliable, this is this and that. It's like, I mean, are we just viewing it that way? Or is it actually? And it's like, it isn't. It can't be. So, yeah, it's like, I don't have the answers, though. Or at least, like, I don't have all of them. I want to, though. So, with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's giving you something to think about. And I'll see you in the next video. Professor Prime out.